Hello, and welcome back to History 101, World Civilizations to 1100. This is Professor Gaughan at Colorado State University in Pueblo. We are in Unit 3, Government and the Articulation of Political Power, and today we're talking about the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic came into being about 50 years after the conquests of Cyrus the Great and the creation of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, and about 50 years before Pericles was the dominant statesman in Athens. If you look at the map of Roman territory around 509, this is actually a little later, around 500, this very dark red spot that you see here is the territory that the Romans controlled. Over the next centuries, the Romans expanded their territory to control most of the Italian peninsula, as well as the islands of Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. We'll look a little more at Roman expansion in just a moment, and also in our next session on the Roman Empire. But let's stop for a minute at 509 and consider what Rome is going through. So as I said, the territory that Rome controls in 509 is quite small. It's just a little chunk of land near the Tiber River in central Italy. What does happen in 509 that has more long-term consequences, perhaps, is the end of the Roman monarchy. Before this time, from 753 BCE to 509, Rome was ruled by a monarchy. In 509, the res publica begins. Res publica is where we get our word republic, although the Romans never put those two together and made one word. It was always the res, the thing or the matter, and publica, public, the public matter or the public thing. So monarchy gets put to an end, and what modern scholars call the republic comes into being. All right, and then the Romans have all this great expansion, and then they have some more great expansion over the next centuries. One of the consequences of their expansion is the incorporation of Polybius into the Roman Empire. Polybius is the author of our primary source document for class. And Polybius is from the territory of Achaea in Greece. As the Romans conquer Greece and other territories for that matter, one of the consequences is that they take hostages. Hostages are pretty common in antiquity, and hostages tended to be members of royal families when there was a royal family, which the Greek city-states mostly didn't have. So powerful citizens in Greek city-states. And they would be taken as hostages to ensure the good behavior of the people back home. But a hostage in antiquity is quite different from a hostage as we think about hostages today in the modern United States. Hostages in antiquity, since they were already members of the elite class, get to hang out with the elite in the place where they are a hostage. So Polybius, when he's a hostage in Rome, which lasts about 17 years, is living with the Scipiones. The Scipiones are probably the most powerful family in Rome at the time that Polybius is living there, if not the most, one of the most powerful families in Rome. So Polybius is taken as a hostage to ensure the good behavior of his city-state back home, and he is also a scholar, and he also writes about Rome, and he writes actually a universal history about Rome and about the whole Mediterranean basin. Why, you might ask, is Thomas Jefferson on your screen at the moment? I wanted to point out that Polybius is important not just for understanding Rome, but also for understanding the beginnings of the government in the United States. Thomas Jefferson had several different translations of Polybius in his collection. So Polybius had an impact on how the early founders of the United States thought about government. And one of the ways in which they had this impact, or Polybius had this impact, was in what we're going to read about how the Romans constructed their government. So Polybius is a knowledgeable observer about events in Rome. And as I say, he's not himself a Roman. He is a Greek citizen, but much of Greece is now subject to Roman control. What Polybius talks about is how the Roman government functions. If you'd like, you might stop the tape here and get out Polybius, read that document, and then come back, or you can continue to listen to this. What I'm interested in with the rest of this presentation is to have you think about the degree to which Polybius is accurate in his report of what's happening in Rome. So what does Polybius see, and what other information might you want to have in order to understand what Polybius sees? And so I want to talk some about what that other information is. Let's touch upon a couple things that are on this slide. I want to come back to this notion of res publica. So as I said, the Romans did not call this time period the res publica. They referred to their government and their country as the public thing, the public matter, the public affair. Very often when decisions are made during the Roman Republic, we see those decisions referred to as being made by Senatus Populusque Romani. That is, roughly translated, the Senate and the people of Rome. So SPQR. You still actually see this image all over Rome today. So you can think about how that fits in with what Polybius says about the Senate and the people when you look at Polybius. Here are a couple other questions that we will be working with in class. So what exactly does Polybius say is our first question. Of course, we want to start there. What does the document say? What does Polybius think about the Roman government that he's writing about? By the way, this document we often refer to as the Roman Constitution. But let me just point out that the Romans don't have a constitution. What Polybius did was he wrote about how the government functioned. And we refer to it as a constitution, but it's not, first of all, it's not a document written by any Romans, certainly not an official document of Rome. And it's and the Romans have no official constitution. Okay, the government just functions this way because of tradition. I should point out, however, that the Romans loved Polybius's version of the story of how they function. Polybius actually asks the question because he wants to know why the Romans were so militarily successful. And this is part of his answer to that question. Okay, so but we'll look specifically at Polybius's answer in class. What I want to talk about now is the other conditions. How might other conditions in Republican Rome have had an impact on how the government actually functioned? The kind of nuances that Polybius doesn't talk about in his so-called constitution. So there are four categories of things I wanted to talk about. One is how conservative the system is. One is how the assemblies are organized, that is, the assemblies of Roman citizens. One is the role of advice in Roman life, and one is the nature of Roman social structure. So we're going to start with the conservative system. When the Romans ousted their king in 509, their last king in 509, they really wanted very much not to have a monarchy. Hopefully that sounds familiar to listeners in the United States. They wanted very much not to have a monarchy, so they constructed their system in such a way so that it would not have a monarchy. This meant magistracies, or offices of the government, were annual. That there was almost never only one magistrate at a time. So people always had a colleague, I should say men. Men always had a colleague in office. And the colleague always had veto power over his other colleague. Veto, V-E-T-O, in Latin means I forbid. And the way veto worked in Rome was the moment someone used that power, the moment a magistrate said, I forbid, all action needed to stop. This meant that it was hard to bring about change in Rome. Because colleagues could veto each other, the moment they say veto, I forbid, the change ceases. Right? There's no new legislation that can be put forth. The Romans were reluctant to change, and part of it is built into their system. It's also part of their nature. Rather, it reminds me a little bit of Egyptians, that there's a conservative system. Change happens very slowly. Number 2 on our list here is the organization of assemblies. So assemblies are made up of, there are 2 assemblies made up of all of the Roman citizens, or 2 assemblies that are going to concern us, made of all of the Roman citizens, and 1 assembly made up of most of the Roman citizens by the end of the Republic, or by the time of Polybius, before the end of the Republic. And the organization of the assemblies is timocratic. Timos means wealth in Greek, so timocratic is the rule of the wealthy. So although every citizen gets a vote, the way the assemblies are set up, and I'm not going into detail about how they're set up because it's quite complicated, but the way they're set up means the rich people get to vote. I keep saying people because I think of the modern world. The rich men get to vote in first. And once you reach 50%, and they also get more power in their vote. So once you reach 50% or 51%, then the voting stops. So the wealthy win. Also, the other thing to think about with assemblies is that the people who call the assemblies have to be magistrates of Rome. They have to be officials of Roman government. So the assemblies are presided over, and they only happen if an official representative of government calls that assembly. So please don't say that the Romans have a democracy. They don't. Okay, number 3 on our list is the role of advice. We hear the word advice and we think, gosh, we could pay attention to that if we feel like it. For the Romans, advice was an entirely different thing. Decisions of the Senate, and by the way, the Senate did not have legislative power, only the assemblies had legislative power. Decisions of the Senate were literally advice to magistrates, which presumably then the magistrates could ignore, at least theoretically. But here's the other thing. Okay, so, I'm going to talk about how difficult it is to ignore advice when I also talk about social structure, so we'll keep this theme going. So first thing is, the Senate gives advice to magistrates, that is, to the officials of government. And the officials of government almost always follow the, and I'm using my little quotation marks, air quotes here, advice of the Senate. Second is, the Romans don't make any decisions on their own. The Romans always consult their concilium. The concilium is a sometimes informal, sometimes more formal body of friends and relatives who will give you advice. So from the public, senatorial, and assembly world, all the way to the private decisions of, how much should I give my daughter in a dowry, all those decisions are made in consultation with other people. So advice matters a great deal in the concilium. let me talk a little bit about the Senate with that idea about advice. The Senate is made up of really, really rich people. Okay, there's a monetary requirement to be a senator. You have to be among the richest, right? So already there's a great deal of exclusion of the ordinary. The Senate, also, in order to be in the Senate, you have to have been elected as a magistrate. That is, you have to have been elected as an official of Roman government. And so the Senate is made up of really, really rich people, and also people who have held public office, who have been elected to public office, so all the ex-magistrates. Then once you're in the Senate, you're in there for the rest of your life. In fact, senatus comes from the Latin word, or the Latin word senatus means old man, right? A bunch of old men. Okay, so the Senate's a bunch of old men. But they're old men who are really, really rich and have a lot of influence with others. We'll look at that and keep in mind then, if the Senate advises a magistrate to do something and the magistrate doesn't do it, then presumably his position in the Senate might never improve. And the Romans always wanted to better their positions, get elected to higher office, get better jobs. For example, the senators also were, or the magistrates were also generals in the army, right? You wanted to get a good military gig, then you had to kind of toe the party line, as it were. We're going to see more of this, how complicated this gets, when we look at social structure. So let's take a look at social structure. The first thing I want to talk about in Rome is the relationship between people who are not of equal status. So the Roman triangle has, social and economic triangle pretty much, has senators at the top, equestrians right below them, and then, of course, a large range of ordinary citizens, although more probably toward the bottom of this triangle than the triangle necessarily looks. And slaves we put down at the bottom and outside of our triangle. Okay. In the relationship of unequals, we have what we call the patron-client relationship. So the patron is economically and socially superior to the client, has more wealth and more prestige in society. And the client and the patron have a reciprocal relationship. That is, the clients give something to the patrons give something back to the client. So one possible example is a patron might give a client some money to help that client, provide a dowry for his daughter. The client then might gather up his friends and buddies and come help the patron when the patron is running for a political office or something like that. The patron-client relationship is pervasive in Rome. So we're not just talking about only senators being patrons. Senators might be patrons of equestrians and people lower, but equestrians themselves, who are clients of senators, might be patrons of people lower on the social scale. So this goes all the way up and down the Roman social and economic hierarchy. Also, the patron-client relationship is not limited by gender. We see women involved in the patron-client relationship as much as we see men involved in the patron-client relationship. So we've got this personal relationship where people owe allegiance to other people based on other things than ideology, based on other things than a particular political agenda. Just to give you a little example of how important the patron-client relationship was to the Romans, there's actually a rule in Rome that patrons and clients can't testify against each other in court. It's much like our modern rule in the United States, where husbands and wives are not required to testify against each other. So the same thing is true for patrons and clients in Rome. And that gives you a sense of what the Romans thought of that particular relationship. Okay, so that's the relationship between unequals, people of different socioeconomic status. We also have relationships of equals. The Romans have a word for friend or friendship, amikitya. They also have a word for enemyship, inimikitya. So your friends are your socioeconomic equals. And this relationship is also reciprocal. You're supposed to do good stuff for your friends, and they're supposed to do good stuff for you, without, again, concern for other agendas, or at least the primary concern should be the relationship. Now, this works also with enemies. So, in enemyship, you should do harm to your enemy. So, again, not something that we think about very much in the United States. I mean, we might want to do it, but we also are uncomfortable with that notion of attacking one's enemy just because they're your enemy. But for the Romans, you try to keep your enemies down. So society functions on this really personal level. And not only does society function this way, but government functions this way. So let's take family as an example, because family is another kind of reciprocal relationship. If a senator, a magistrate, goes off to fight in a war, he might bring his nephew with him on the campaign, so that his nephew then learns about fighting. So you're supposed to get your family into power. You're supposed to get your friends into power. You're supposed to attack your enemies. And you're supposed to do favors for your clients and your patrons. This whole social system is also how government works in Rome. So when Polybius talks about the different systems in place, I want you to keep in mind the social dimensions of Roman government. And I also want you to keep in mind some of the caveats that I gave you about the way government itself was organized. In other words, the assemblies that are timocratic, one more than the other, but the way they work out, they tend to be timocratic. The importance of advice, and you can also think about the importance of advice in line with the social structure, and also the conservatism of Rome. So in class, we will talk about what Polybius says about the Roman Republic and how we might modify what Polybius says given the nature of society and government in Rome. I look forward to talking with you in class.